Today we're talking about Martin Diamond and maybe doing a little bit of comparative stuff with Diamond and Wilmore Kendall and trying to draw some contrasts between them and sort of different strains of conservatism that they represent. So we can start out by pointing out that Diamond was a student of Leo Strauss. And as you know, in the Bush, well, as you may know, in the Bush administration, people tended to regard the Straussians as sort of the roots of all conservative evil, which is partly a misunderstanding of Strauss and partly a correct understanding of some of the kind of excesses of some of his followers. I don't think it's right to pin that on Strauss, but we can talk about that some other time. What the Straussians brought, though, was a skepticism of tradition and an elevation of principle. Kendall, going back to Russell Kirk, going back to Richard Weaver, right, all going back to Burke, are all sort of have in their minds that tradition is good. Or to put it another way, the idea that good and old are the same, right? And Straussians object to this just in the same way that they object to the American confusion of new and improved, right? Just because something is old doesn't mean it's good. Just because something is new doesn't mean it's improved. And if you're going to have that as your basis of decision, right, then you could defend anything on the basis of that's the way we've always done it, right? So you have to be careful about that. The Straussians think. The conservatives or the Burkeans, the Kendalls are not so persuaded of that. So Diamond and the other followers of Jaffa, and we'll read other followers of Strauss, and we'll read Harry Jaffa next week, are not sort of traditional Burke type conservatives. If you want to think about it this way, you can think, their ideas, their principles are more similar to those of the Catholic Church, right? They're introducing some idea of natural law, and that it's natural law that authorizes the things that, particularly in conservative circles, right? That natural law authorizes government to take certain shapes, authorizes certain things as good and bad, authorizes certain approaches to character as being appropriate or authoritative. It's a question of where you want to put your emphasis or your origin, where you want to place your origin, right? Is it in nature or God, either one? In the Catholic tradition, they work together. Or is it just in human tradition, human choice, right? So you have to think about sort of where you want to start with all of that. Because the Straussians are more receptive to principle, they're more friendly to John Locke. And this is the big sort of thing within American political science, right? It's not, Europeans don't care about this, but Americans really do care about Locke. Kendall, right, as we saw, wanted something that predated Locke. The Mayflower Compact qualifies beautifully for that because it was written before Locke was even born, right? Mayflower Compact is 1620, Locke was born in 1632. So, you have something that does not in any way depend on John Locke for its authority, right? And so you can write him out of the American political tradition altogether. Yeah. Um, Diamond takes us down a different path, right? He takes us down a different and in some ways more challenging path, I think, of finding the grounds of the sobriety of the American Revolution. And you remember from Weaver and from Kirk, the concern, the fear is that a revolution, once you start a revolution, it gets out of control. It, like the French Revolution, devours its children. Like the Russian Revolution, right, ends up in chaos and disorder. And of course, understand that, you know, even in 73, when Diamond writes this, the fear of communism, of international communism, of the international conspiracy that threatens to come and embrace the United States, that is a real fear. And I think people in my generation might understand that. We've forgotten a lot about it, but we sort of understand that. People of your generation have no experience with that. And so it's important to understand that this was a real concern for people. So Diamond is looking for sobriety, right? Where does the sobriety of the American Revolution come from? Because in some ways, Martin Diamond, I think, is absolutely right. Sorry, construction. In some ways, I think Martin Diamond is absolutely right that the extraordinary part of the story of the American Revolution is its sobriety, okay? I apologize. This is going to go on for a while, so we'll just pause. Let it happen. Okay. So Diamond lays out where this sobriety comes from. And so he begins with Lincoln. As we'll see, Jaffa also begins with Lincoln, but takes it in a very different direction than Diamond does. So what does it mean to say that these two documents, the Constitution and the Declaration, are connected? Because that's what Lincoln alludes to when he alludes to the importance of Philadelphia. Yeah, this is going to go on for a while, so just bear with me. So Constitution and Declaration, two springs of our existence, right? So Diamond isn't wasting his time with the bullshit that Kendall and others want to do, right? They want to find a tradition, they want to find an origin, they want to find something that is not rooted in some sort of natural law or something like that. To them, that's too touchy-feely, right? They want something, they want what real people really did. And Diamond says, no, that's not how we're going to do it. We're going to go back to Locke. And we're going to do this by going through the Declaration and the Constitution. So for Lincoln, the Declaration and the Constitution have the same principle, the same origin, the same ground. And so that's what Diamond is looking for. So how can you get past the challenge? Understand that for Diamond and for American political science generally, the idea is that the Declaration is one thing, is a democratic document, and the Constitution is almost, if you read Charles Beard or somebody like that, is almost an anti-democratic document, right? And so they're opposed in some way. So it is odd and interesting that Diamond and Jaffa both make the argument that the Declaration and the Constitution go hand in hand. So think about that and what kinds of implications that would have, right? A lot of people, well, we'll get to that when we talk about Jaffa, okay? So for Diamond, the critical thing is that both of them are sober or even skeptical or reserved about democracy, right? The democracy is not automatically the best form of government. And so the Declaration, as Diamond says, is on 211, as Diamond says, is about sentiments, about feelings. It's not about ideas, thoughts, conclusions, rational principles. It's about how you feel about something. And Diamond draws this out, right? He carefully limits his indebtedness to the Declaration only to certain sentiments and feelings, that is, to the spirit of liberty within which he conceives American government and its institutions, right? There is nothing, Diamond says, in the Declaration which goes beyond that sentiment of liberty. And then the phrase that Jaffa is going to hammer Diamond with over and over again, correctly or not, is the Declaration is devoid of guidance as to what those institutions should be, right? So this no guidance thesis coming from the Declaration, Jaffa says that's Diamond's big mistake. And so he goes on through the self-evident truths of the Declaration. Right? How does Diamond conceive of this? Right? As most of you know, I've done this in American Political Thought, channeling Michael Zuckert, who's actually channeling Diamond when he does it. The evidentness of the truths is on 213, is contained within the truths themselves, right? And you can do this with a kind of a geometrical principle, which is not accidental, right? Because this actually goes back to Hobbes. The evidentness of the truths is contained within the truths themselves. If A equals B and B equals C, you know, right? If you know the meaning of the term equals, you know then that A equals C. It has to, right? At least in the way that we do logic, it has to. Okay, so these truths, he says, do not derive by inference, do not rise by inference from one another, but are each equally and independently self-evident. So the most important truth, Diamond says, is the comprehensive one regarding the institution of government. The government exists to secure unalienable rights and must be instituted by popular consent. Okay, so consent and rights. And Diamond is going to develop that in his own way, as you see. So on 214, then he makes the orthodox Lockean point in that first full paragraph. The people need not then establish a government which operates by means of consent. So Diamond is making a distinction there, right, between the establishment of government and the operation of government. So government has to be established by consent of the people, but does not have to operate by consent of the people. It could totally ignore people's desires. It could be a monarchy. It could be an aristocracy, something else, right? It's a collective right. It's the right of the people corporately as a body, not an individual right. So I don't have a right to consent or withhold my consent from government. I do have a right to join with others, to join with the nation in deciding to form a government. Okay? Sorry, I'm looking at my notes here. Yeah, it's a collective right. And the Declaration is neutral on the question of forms. And why is that? Because Diamond says the people who made the American Revolution left open the question of forms of government. There. left open the question of forms of government. They left it to the future to make the choices, to decide exactly how that was going to go. And so he develops this argument, right? He says what was revolutionary, what was truly revolutionary, this is on 216, in the American Revolution and its Declaration of Independence was that liberty, civil liberty, the doctrine of certain unalienable rights was made the end of government. And so he sort of lies, you know what I'm saying? He lays out the evolution of American understanding of rights. Others have done this. You can do this, by the way, with regard to the works of Edward Coke, right, which you've probably heard me talk about before. Americans understood constitutions and constitutionalism in a way that derives from Edward Coke, right, who wrote in the 1640s, well before the English Revolution. And British, by 1776 or even 1763, British people understand constitutions in terms of Blackstone. And so Americans and Brits have very different ideas of what English law is, of what English liberties are, of what English rights are, and how they derive. And America has a different understanding of how they're related to democracy, right? So for Coke, the idea that popular participation in government is important. This is what Diamond doesn't say. For Coke, that idea is intrinsic in this idea of protecting American liberties. Whereas for Blackstone, that's not necessary at all. Blackstone is an unashamed partisan of aristocracy. So, and so you see on the bottom of 216 and then on 217, he talks about right, gradually the issue subtly changed, and the abstract idea of liberty came to overlay the appeal to traditional and concrete English liberties. So there's an evolution in America from liberties, English liberties, the body of the traditional protections that the English had given, to a more abstract idea, a more Lockean idea of liberty. Which, as I said, I think is also perfectly consistent with Edward Coke. And that's at the bottom of 216. But notice what he does. I mean, he does something very subtle here on 217. He says, the modern followers of Burke, this is in that first full paragraph, while modern followers of Edmund Burke may warn of the dangers of devotion to abstract principles, they cannot blink aside the revolutionary American devotion to precisely such an abstract principle. In other words, Kirk and those people are just wrong about the American Revolution. And guess what? They understood that. Kirk and others understood that Diamond was attacking. But what you see what he does later on in that paragraph, right? So he says, it's one thing to be abstractly devoted to the reign of virtue or unlimited equality, blah, blah, blah. But then he changes, right? He talks about civil liberty. That's interesting, right? Because that's not liberty. Civil, the addition of the word civil there is really critical. It means that the liberty that you're talking about is not a liberty to, it hasn't any absolute dimension to it, right? That civil liberty is liberty within a formula, a framework of law. And that's important. So Diamond kind of subtly changes the nature of the discussion here. in a way that makes it much more compatible, actually, with what Kirk and Weaver and others have talked about. So the American Revolution, the sobriety of the American Revolution, comes from the fact that Americans are devoted to this principle of civil liberty, right? And not just liberty, right? Liberty is an abstract principle, he says, capable of achievement. Jacobin or Leninist equality or mass fraternity or not. So he's sort of lowering the threshold of what liberty amounts to. What else do we need to say? Oh, and then I'll skip over some of this stuff, but on 220 and 221, right, he talks about the degree to which the Constitution embraces democracy. And so he makes the argument that the Constitution really is a democratic document. That the Declaration of Independence is sort of indifferent as between democracy and anything else, whereas the Constitution is, for its moment, an emphatically democratic thing, because it specifies the broadest possible franchise, right? The franchise for voting for the state legislatures. And that sort of ties him back to Lincoln then, because Americans, well, okay, let me put it this way. For Diamond, Americans became democratic without ever intending to become democratic, right? That's where tradition makes a difference in the American American history. But as Tocqueville explains, right, they sort of were born democratic without having intended to be democratic. But I would say that there's one sort of thing that Diamond neglects to say about the Constitution, and that is, as probably some of you have heard me say, the Constitution does not allow any status above that of citizen, right? There are no titles of nobility. But the Constitution leaves it open to the states to declare statuses lower than that of citizen. And that's critical, and that of course becomes the operating issue of the Civil War. So I'm going to leave this there. We'll talk in the forums. So raise questions in the forums or respond to this in some way, and we will have more later. Thanks. Bye.